Well, in this church, it is always about what Jesus has done for us. We open this book, and it is always about the confidence we have because of Jesus. And then we take that confidence that what Jesus has done is good for us and changes us and washes over us. And we ask ourselves, so now what? What difference does that make in my life now? And we apply it to all different areas of our lives. You never know what he's going to talk about in here. So today you have three options. Do you want to hear the gospel applied, how Jesus' life and death for the world makes a difference when it comes to sex, or when it comes to politics, or when it comes to money? Which do you prefer? I got 3 sermons. I could preach either one. I think given those options, we'd all take money, because the other two are pretty volatile, and God has much to say about you. How much time do you have? I don't mean for the sermon. I just mean, how much time do you have? How much money do you have? Lots of times we would answer both those questions the same way. Not enough, right? And then there are other times we'd open the Bible and our answer would be, none. None of it is mine. The Bible says the earth is the Lord's. The earth and everything in it. The world and all who live in it. So it's all his. And he gives us a little bit of time here. No one knows how long. He gives us a little bit of money here. No one knows in the end how much. Why does God give us his stuff? If it all belongs to him, why does he let us use and why does he give us his stuff? Let me show you 4 passages, and you tell me the reason that you see in each passage. Here's the first one, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. You look at that verse, answer the question, why does God give us stuff? To provide for? Yeah, family, take care of ourselves, take care of our families. That's why he gives us stuff. Here's another reason. 1 Corinthians 6:2. Kind of have to read between the lines a little bit, but why does God give us stuff? To provide for Jesus' work through his church. That's what Paul's talking about there. When I come and your church in Jerusalem, you'll have an offering, or in Corinth, and I'll take it to the church in Jerusalem and help them out. So it's another reason to provide for the work of his church. Third reason, 1 John 3, 16 to 18. Tell me why God gives us his stuff. He loves us, and because of that, we take care of each other. Yeah, we have been loved by him, and so we turn around and we love others, especially those who aren't as blessed materially. We want to care for them, to care for the poor. Here's a 4th reason. Last one, Romans 13, 6 to 7, everyone's favorite. Tell me why God gives us stuff. It's coming up. Pay taxes, take care of the government. Nobody wanted to say that, but a government worker went ahead and said it anyway. Yeah, those are the biblical reasons God gives us stuff. We call this whole teaching of how we use our time, how we use the abilities we have, how we manage the stuff he gives us. We call that stewardship, meaning managing somebody else's stuff. And even pagans know you don't get to keep it. Even pagans know when you go in a box at the end of your life, they don't throw your car keys in there for you. All right, you don't get that stuff. They don't throw your debit card in there with you in the coffin. Although I do want to be buried in my favorite shoes, because I like those. But other than that, everybody else everything else just goes to somebody else, right? Because you don't get to keep it. So God gives us some stuff for a while to manage. And then he tells us some things about how we go about managing this stuff he gives us, our time, our money, our abilities. Things like these. Things that we don't want to do first. 1 Timothy, and again, I won't read the verse, but 1 Timothy 6, 9 to 10, you look at that verse and you tell me, what do we not want to do? Fall into temptation, and the specific reason for the temptation here is wanting to get rich. Nothing wrong with being rich. That's not sinful at all. But what's it called when you want stuff that isn't yours? Coveting, yeah. So avoid the coveting thing that's so easy to fall into. And then according to Ephesians 4:28, what do we want to avoid when it comes to stuff? Don't take stuff that isn't yours. So don't just want it that's not yours. That's coveting, a sinful desire for what isn't yours. And just don't just take it, right? On the other hand, God tells us we do want to cultivate certain attitudes about our time and about our stuff and his stuff. Tell me an attitude we want to cultivate that you see in 1 Timothy 6:6. What's the attitude? Contentment, yeah. To be content with what I have. And I tell you what, nobody in this room would call himself or herself rich. But all of us, and I mean all of us, are. All you have to do is open your closet. There's plenty of clothes. Open your refrigerator. There's something to eat. We are. And we really can be content with what he gives us and be thankful for what he gives us at whatever level he chooses to do that. 2 Corinthians 9, 6 to 8. What's the attitude we want to cultivate? The attitude or the action? Yeah, you see it in there? Generosity in the way that we share with others. There's another one. What do we want to cultivate? Colossians 3:22. By the way, don't let the word slaves throw you here. Our history of slavery in our context was racial. In this context, it wasn't racial. It was economic. You could be of any race and sell yourself as a slave in order to provide for your family. So this would translate more into our world as your job, which for some sounds like slavery. But it would translate into our world as a job. And what does he tell us about that job? What do we want to pursue? Yeah, do it well. Work hard at it. So there are some things we want to avoid when it comes to the things God gives us, some things we want to pursue, and there's so much on this subject. We're going to narrow the focus down to just one of those purposes for which God gives us stuff. The one that you saw earlier on giving to Jesus' church, that others might know him. So we're just going to focus on, on those things, and we need to, because we handle money so much. The debit card, the savings, and whatever, all the ways we handle money throughout the week. It's good for us to stop and ask the Lord Jesus, who gives us this stuff, teach me about this. Tell me what it is you want me to do with it. So we're going to narrow it down to what this book says about giving to Jesus' work through his church. We'll study the principles here. We'll walk through them. I'll show you the passages. But ultimately, the rubber has to hit the road, and we make decisions about what we're going to do privately, individually, what we're going to do with those principles, and we translate them into action. And so we're going to we're going to study those principles here. Then we're going to walk out of here, walk into the gym, and gather around tables where we'll help each other. And if you're thinking this is a private matter, helping is not a private thing. Some of you are in helping professions. You love to help people. Why not with this? If you're saying, I don't need help with it, I'm doing all right, well, then help somebody else. And if you're saying, boy, I could use some help with this, I'm not sure I understand or how others apply it, then we'll listen to each other and we'll help each other. First, though, let's study these principles. Here's the first one. Christian giving is to be sacrificial. The setup for this story comes from Jesus taking his disciples and positioning them in the temple where people were walking by and dropping their coins into the metal gathering bucket. The more you dropped, the more noise it made, and the better you looked. And some people loved that. But then Jesus said there was this widow who came. So she didn't have anybody to support her. She didn't have much. In fact, all she had was a couple of pennies. And she put those in. And then this is what Jesus said. Mark 12:41. And these passages for each of these principles are in your folder. I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. Now, I don't think Jesus is teaching me that I need to give my entire paycheck to his work of his church. But I think he is teaching me, Randy, you could give more. In fact, Karen and I could double our giving and not go hungry and not go naked. The question is only, how much am I going to keep and how much am I going to give? We don't talk here about equal gifts. That's why nobody prescribes what your giving should be. We won't do that ever. But it is to be sacrificial. So a question that I need to be asking myself, if I'm going to take anything from Mark 12:41, is what did this cost me? What did this gift cost me? That might help me gauge how sacrificial it is. Second principle, Christian giving is a matter of what I have. And the verse there is Luke 16:10. Whoever can be trusted with very little, Jesus said, can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little, meaning also dishonest with him, robbing him of what belongs to him, will also be dishonest with much. Sometimes I hear people say, boy, Pastor, if I ever make it, if I get rich, am I ever going to give? I don't know about that. There's the old story about the preacher who talked to the farmer and said, if you had $200, would you give $100 to the Lord? And the farmer said, yeah, you know I would. The preacher asked, well, if you had 2 cows, would you give one of those to the Lord? And the farmer said, well, yeah, you know I would. The preacher asked, well, if you had 2 pigs, would you give one of those to the Lord? And the farmer said, now that's not fair, preacher. You know I have 2 pigs. Yeah, a little nervous laughter there. You ever hear someone say, if I win the lottery, I'm going to give so much? I doubt it, because if I'm not giving now, out of what I have now, I'm probably going to find plenty of other things, no matter how many millions God would give me in the future. And by the way, God's not poor. Right? He doesn't need my money. What does he own? Everything. Everything. He's going to get his work done. He's going to get the gospel proclaimed to others, even without my gift. But I do sometimes think this: if I'm not using what he's giving me for his purposes and his ways, why would he give me more? This is pretty much what he says in Luke 16:10. But Christian giving comes out of what I have now, not thinking about what it might be in the future. Third one, giving amounts are to be personally determined. I said this earlier, no one's going to tell you how much you should give, but they are to be personally determined. God works in our hearts. Jesus demonstrated that in his conversation with a man named Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. The Apostle Paul taught that here in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. Each one should give whatever he has decided in his heart to give. Not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Some well-meaning people have taken Old Testament principles of tithing and said, well, that's what you do. Some people even call that giving of our tithes at church, which is 10% of what God has given us. That's a little simplistic, actually too simplistic. The tithe in the Old Testament was very different from our giving today. In the Old Testament, their way of living as a nation of Israel, the people of God, was a theocracy. God was king. And God was running the government through one of the 12 tribes called the Levites. They didn't work outside of that role to be the government of his people. And the rest of them supported that with this tithe. That's how they made their living. But it's too easy to say it was a tithe and that's what it was, because in effect, it wasn't quite like that. There was the Levite tax, which went to support the Levites. That was 10% of your income. But there was a second tithe called the festival tithe. The festival tithe that was used to buy food for the great festivals that were held for God's people at the temple in Jerusalem, sort of like a national potluck tax. That's another 10%. There was a third 10% that was taxed every third year, called the poor tax. Every third year, there was another 10% to help provide for the poor and disabled. So after the Levite tax, you have 90% of what God gave you. After the second tax, the festival tax, you're down to 81%. And then after the third one, the poor tax, you were down to somewhere around 78% of your income. But there were more. There was profit sharing. You couldn't harvest your field all the way to the edges so the poor could gather from there. There was the temple tax that was used to buy bread for the daily offerings at the temple. There was the Sabbath tax. Every 7th year, your land would lay fallow. You wouldn't get income from that. There was the Jubilee tax. Every 50th year, all debts were canceled so that no family was in poverty for more than 2 generations. What do we call enforced giving to the government? Taxes! And so all those tithes were more like taxes than anything else, and they were used to support the government. Probably came to about 30%, something or more, of a person's income. But even in the Old Testament, when God asked his people to give as an act of worship, he said it's a matter of the heart. For example, when he told Moses to gather the articles, the material needed to build the tabernacle, Moses put it this way. He told the people, "Give whatever in your heart you have decided to give." And the result? The people brought so much that finally Moses had to say, "Would you people stop? We've got too much." Which is just a typical announcement in church, right? I know some people you just cut to the chase, Pastor, I don't want to do all this work. Just tell me, what should I give? And nobody can, and I can't, and nobody can, because God doesn't. And Jesus, who had the opportunity to tell people, well, tithe, didn't. He said it's a matter of your heart. As you take all these principles we're learning and apply them. And so we take these principles and we have our conversation with God. If you're married, with each other. If you're single, maybe a little more challenging. Maybe you have this conversation just by yourself and God. Maybe you talk to a friend, you talk to your growth group. God, am I honoring you? Am I placing you first in my spending plan? How I use my money? Am I placing you first? That's a good question. I like to think of it, if I were giving my wife the same amount of money that I'm giving to the Lord Jesus for the work of his church, would she feel honored and loved? Or would she say, man, you are cheap, because she knows how much money I make? The Lord owns it all. He gives it to us, and he knows too. So the question is, am I honoring you by how I use this? And that means percentage or proportionate to what I have now, what God is giving me now. That's the principle from tithing that we ought to take. And if you're not used to thinking of the money you give to Jesus and the work of his church as a percentage of what God is giving you, I encourage you to try it. Sit down, figure it out, and set a percentage. I'm not telling you what that percentage needs to be. But think of it in terms of what God is giving you now, and then be honest with him. because it's all in his pocket anyway, and I'm just talking to you about how I'm going to use your stuff. All right, fourth principle. Giving is to be planned. And this is clear in 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with his income. That sounds planned to me. In another place, here's this verse we encountered before, 1 Corinthians 9:7. Each man, each one, should give what he's decided in his heart. That little phrase, give what he's decided in his heart, could easily be translated, should set aside beforehand. I like that better. It's more accurate, for one thing. Give what he's decided in his heart sort of puts the emphasis on my heart and how I feel about it. But set aside beforehand, that has a little better instruction for me. Set aside beforehand what he's decided to give. One of the things that we enjoy here at St. Andrew is a culture of ministry, a culture of service. There's so many people who are doing so many things to make Jesus' church go about Jesus' work. Church is a volunteer organization. It really is different from volunteering anywhere else, but it really is effective and does its work through God's people serving. Every once in a while, though, it's probably easy to think, well, I serve, so I don't need to pay attention to giving. Instead of giving money, I serve. Instead of giving money, I serve, which is wonderful to serve. But do you see this verse? Each one. Each of you. So service is for all of us. But so are these principles of giving for all of us. Last one. Giving is to be generous. I will read all these verses. 2 Corinthians 9, 6-11. Remember this. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Now, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be made rich in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. I mean, his generosity with us is what moves us to be generous with others. I cannot outgive what God has given me. And I'm not just talking about money now. What he's given me in his son Jesus, I can't do better than that. But there are things that challenge me. They say every person has his price. For some, it's just wanting to keep more to the extent I'll cheat on taxes or expense accounts in order to keep more. For another, it's being stingy instead of generous with others in need. To somebody else, it's getting upside down with the money I put into my hobbies and my own desires instead of having it to give and to serve for the other purposes for which God gives me his stuff. What's your price? I hope you don't have one, but I suspect you do. Because I do. You know when I sell out? When I sell out and I ignore these principles, it's when I forget what Jesus promised in Matthew 6:33. Matthew 6:33. Jesus said, "Seek first my kingdom, my righteousness, and all these other things will be given to you as well." The kingdom of God is his rule in my heart that comes about through the Spirit's work through word and sacrament. The righteousness of Jesus is the perfection he has attained and is mine by faith. And Jesus promises you seek those things first, and I'll take care of everything else you need. Everybody else in this world is going to judge us by what we look like, by what we have, by what we've done, by what we can do, by how well we're keeping up, by our status, by our position, whatever else. Not God. He looks at you and says, you are washed clean. Grace has washed over you. You're my precious possession. I don't care, God is saying, what other people think about you or how they look upon you, or you are precious to me. And I proved it with the death of my Son. And now we prove to him how grateful we are by how we live, including taking these principles and with his help putting them into practice. And for that we need to help each other. So we're going to walk out of here. We're going to conclude this worship service in the gym with prayer and song, but we have time left just in this worship time frame. What time is it? Anybody know? Nobody's checked. It was a little too fast. Levi, what time is it? 8:40. So we have about 25 minutes or so, until about 5 after the hour, I guess. So we're going to walk out of here. We're going to go into the gym, except the kids 5th grade and below. 5th grade and below, come to the front before the herd of people, which isn't such a big herd this morning. Before the herd of people leaves, 5th grade and below, come to the front because you stay in here. Mr. Wolf has a devotion for you. Mr. Hochmuth has fruit snacks for you. Adults, you can't stay. Fruit snacks for you. Parents, if you have questions, they're allergen-free, gluten-free, hyper everything, so they're all fine. We've sterilized them. They're fine. But if you have questions about the food your kids are going to get, then just check with Mr. Hochmuth back there. And then he's going to show a movie to you, and we'll wrap up at the same time so parents will be able to meet the kids around the donuts in the atrium.